rolling. Gonna give it a second. Okay. So now that we have our architectural photos, we are ready to get into the edits in Lightroom Classic. So I'm going to show you how to edit our photos from the shoot at Cafe Brouwer, since those were taken in sunny daylight. And then I'll also show you how to edit some architectural photos taken in cloudy light and how that looks a little bit different. How we'll be able to really punch up some of the contrast, detail, and definition for those images. So let's open Lightroom Classic and get started. Okay, so I have our architectural demo photos pulled up right over here of Cafe Brouwer, and I've starred the one that I'd like to work with, but something that you'll notice is pretty common with architectural photography is that sometimes you have to kind of stay there and wait and take a few photos until you get the right views without the cars or people or bikes or whatever that might be in the way, unless things kind of serendipitously line up. But I've starred this image to move forward with our edit, and then I've also imported another previous shoot with some buildings that I photographed in Lincoln Park, and this includes the Performing Arts building as well as some of the buildings along Racine. So I've double starred the images that I'd like to work with for our demo today, and you'll see those as I pull them up here. This one, I'd like to talk about how we can really correct for a little bit of that super tiltiness that happened over here, and how photographing wider than what you think you need can really save you with architectural photography. And then I have a couple of other images along Fullerton and Racine that we'll take a look at. So let's get started with the photo from Cafe Brouwer from my video demo. And we're going to go over to the Develop module first thing. Now, with architectural photography, you'll notice that there's some things that are similar to editing portraits or objects, and some things that we're going to push a little bit further and a little bit differently. Just like with any photo shoot, I'm going to start with setting my black and my white point. So I'm going to hold down that Option key and move this slider over to the side. Same thing for blacks. We're going to find those deepest, richest black points here, pull that in. Perfect. And then I'm going to immediately come down to my lens corrections, where I'm going to remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. Now, one thing I didn't mention is you are looking through the images that you're going to be editing. In fact, I think I started this edit on the wrong one over here. Let's see, come back. Is that you want to make sure that your photo that you've taken is really in nice, sharp focus. So I know that we zoomed in on the back of the camera while we were out at the shoot, but I want to show you I can also zoom in right here. With Lightroom, I can set my my window to be at a 3:1, and I can see some really nice, sharp, tack sharp focus here in my bricks. Great. So then I'll go back to fit, and we can see the whole image. So I've set my black and my white point, and I've checked my lens corrections. The next thing that's really important to do with architecture is we want to get those verticals straight. We don't want them to be leaning or tilting. If we're photographing kind of looking at an up angle, we don't want to run into converging verticals, which is where the verticals would hypothetically converge in space because you're shooting going up and you get that 1-point perspective effect. There's a couple different ways to deal with this in Lightroom. I can use my transform options here to use one of my presets like level or vertical. With architecture, I find that vertical tends to be the most accurate, and it shows a grid here and it gets those verticals of the building lined up nice and straight with my grid. Now, if I hit off, there is another way to do this that sometimes works more effectively. I always try to do both just to see, what's going to happen. But if you find this symbol right over here, which are your guides or guided upright tool, you can click that or hit Shift+T and draw two vertical lines, which would be hypothetically parallel to each other, as far apart as you possibly can on the image. And don't worry, we'll do this a couple of times as we work through my different examples here. And it actually lines them up to make your vertical adjustment, which is awesome. Then I can put that back. The next thing I want to do, once I've straightened my verticals in that Transform tab, is I want to make sure that I've cropped in exactly where I'd like. And as you remember, we photographed this a little bit wider than what we need. So when I hit the R button to crop, I can hold down my Shift key to maintain that aspect ratio and go ahead and frame this so that I'm eliminating this lamppost shadow, just like that. Perfect. So now I have some really great framing. This is my before and after, and I've really adjusted and affected how my verticals look. So now I can come up and start modifying my basic tonal corrections. And with architecture, the first thing I'm always going to do is pull my highlights all the way down and my shadows up pretty significantly. You can remember this by saying highlights down, shadows up. That's the way I edit stuff. Or at least that's what I say to myself in my own head while I'm walking through these edits. Now, the folks on the Adobe team who designed Photoshop and Lightroom actually had always intended this to be the best starting point to edit and work with images of architecture where you want to bring out as much contrast and detail as possible. Now, once I do this, the image is not done. I've just created a space and kind of grayed out the image by laying down this playing space where I can really start to affect my dynamic range. It looks grayed out, it looks a little HDR, doesn't look quite right. So within the parameters of my highlights being down -100 and my shadows being up +100, I can then affect things like contrast. So if I pull this up, and I can go pretty significantly here, like way more than a portrait, for example, let's say +51, somewhere usually between 45 and 65 works as far as contrast edits. And I can also affect my exposure a little bit if I need to, going down or up. It looks pretty good. I photographed this in great light, so I don't need to make too many adjustments there. But the first thing I'm going to look at is contrast. Then I'm going to go down to clarity. Now, you remember with portraits, we tend to take out clarity from the portrait to kind of add that nice skin smoothing effect. With architecture, we want things to be really nice and sharp, so I'll add between 25 and 45 on the clarity scale, just for that added sort of punchiness. And if I hit that before and after, you can see how much sharper this image is, how much more punchy and vivid the image is. When I punched up my contrast to 51, I did end up sort of pushing my temperature and some of my oranges over to be a little bit too intense. So many times I will pull out some of my oranges and yellows by decreasing the temperature there until it looks right, not too orangey. And I'll scroll down to my HSL color window and pull out specifically, -5 or -10 oranges, -5 or -10 yellows down here as well. Sometimes it can make your greens a little bit too vivid also, so I might take out between 15 and 30 as far as my greens, so they aren't quite as dominant. And again, you can see the before and after, and specifically in my HSL window, before and after. It's really subtle, but especially if you're thinking you might print these images, it's very, very helpful. Now, one other way I can affect my contrast, which is a skill that we learned in previous editing demos, is coming over to my tone curve And I'm going to specifically edit my lights, darks, and shadows. So I'll add 5 or 10 to my lights. I'll add 15 or so, 15 to 20 to my darks, pull those up a little bit, and then I'll compensate by subtracting some of my shadows, generally between -10 and -20. But again, I encourage you to experiment with this window and see what works best for your specific image. So now I'm in a place where I can start adding a bit of masking and selectively burning in highlights, just like what I would be doing if I was working on this image in a dark room. So I'm going to come up and grab my graduated filter. I can also hit M, the button M, and I want my effect to be set to burn highlights. And you're going to notice, especially with images that have sky, burning in the highlights is really great in the sky, just like that, pulling down that mask to add in a little bit of that really nice blue saturation up top, which works really, really well. I'm going to hit M again, and then M, and I will add another mask down here at the bottom to our pavement leading into Cafe Brouwer. And of course, within that window, I can always make slight adjustments to my exposure and my highlights within that given mask. I'll hit M again to get out of that. The other thing I'm noticing is that all of my bricks are really punching back a lot of really bright light. Even though they're red bricks, they are pretty reflective, and that light post, for example, is super, super bright in my piece. So what I'll probably do is add one more layer selectively using my K shortcut to get to my brush. I'm going to set that effect to burn highlights, and again, just like if I was in a dark room, I can burn in the highlights on the surface of that building really nicely. And this historic building is really starting to look great in the image. I'm going to hit K, and then I'm going to hit M to mask, and we're going to mask, I think, some of the highlights out of these green trees over here. Now, and I'm walking you through every single detailed step so that you have a good idea of what we're doing. But again, we're going to do this to a couple more images after this one. Now, the last thing I'm going to do, I know that I have a really wonderfully sharp image because I photographed at f8. Things are looking really, really nice right here. But in architectural photos, before I export, I will always come down to my detail window and add in some sharpening. Generally speaking, for architecture, I can get away with between 65 and 75 points of additional sharpening here, which is going to make a pretty big difference. And I can see this especially if I zoom in here on my bricks. Here is the detail module turned off and the detail module turned on. And you can see how that building all of a sudden has this really nice sense of definition when it didn't even necessarily look blurry before. That little punch of detail and sharpening just makes this image sing. So this one, in my opinion, is ready for export. But before we do that, let's come back over to our library and take a look at a few other examples. I'm going to go to this shoot that I did around the same time last year with my photography class because we walked all around Lincoln Park finding some good buildings that would be good candidates for editing. And so we'll start with the Performing Arts Center, and the thing that I want you guys to realize about these images as opposed to the image of Cafe Brouwer is that these ones are photographed on a cloudy day. And what's great is that you can still see to some extent where the light is hitting the building. And in this case, we have some sunshine coming through the clouds on this side, and this side's not quite as illuminated. But similar to Cafe Brouwer, I'm trying to frame these buildings where I have an oblique. I'm not just photographing the front of the building, which is totally appropriate sometimes, but if I want to show the volume and a sense of three-dimensionality to a given structure, it's helpful to include an oblique in the way that you photograph it. So that's the area where these two panes are kind of coming together, these two panels are coming together at a corner. That's going to be your oblique, and there are so many examples of this in Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis. Plenty of Rust Belt cities have wonderful street corners where this is the view that you see while standing at the corner. So let's go over to the Develop module and start making some of the adjustments on these buildings. First thing I'm going to do is set my black and my white point by holding down that Option key and making sure I bring my darkest black and my whitest white into gamut if this was to be printed. Then I'm going to scroll down and apply my lens correction, so I'll hit Remove Chromatic Aberration and Enable Profile Corrections. And then I'm going to go down to my Transform window and make sure that we get our crop and our verticals exactly how we want. So we can try our vertical correction here, see how it looks. Not too bad. Or I can grab my upright guided transform tool over here and draw 2 vertical lines on either side of the building here. Put one over here and then grab this vertical over here. We want them to be as far apart as possible. That looks pretty good. So once I have applied that transformation, so I have my verticals straight, I'm going to hit the R button for crop. Hold down the Shift key and get this nice and in frame without that white space here. Another helpful tab in the transform function is constrain crop. Sometimes that works out, and then sometimes it's helpful to have full control over the crop of your image. Then I'll hit enter, and there we go. Here's my before. Here's my after. Already looks way more in line with what we see with our eyes and how gravity is pulling on this image. Okay, so now we can come up and start making our basic tonal adjustments. And just like with the image of Cafe Brower and with architectural photos, I'm going to start by taking my highlights all the way down and pull my shadows up. Don't want to lose too much, so somewhere between 70 and 100 it looks like is working pretty well for this image. Now I've kind of grayed out my high dynamic range, so now I'm going to add back in some contrast around 40 or 50 points. Starting to get a little bit yellowy from those adjustments, so that's definitely something we're going to come back to and adjust next. I'll add about 20 or 30 points of clarity. Again, you don't want to push that too far, otherwise you start to get a really kind of gritty looking HDR image, which we want to avoid. I'm going to pull out some temperature by clicking temp and using my minus key to pull some of that yellow hue out, and then I'll come down to my HSL window and pull out some of my oranges, some of my yellows. Be in a really great spot here. Perfect. Here's my before and here's my after. This building is really starting to sing. Let's add a little bit of extra punch using that tone curve. Kind of see, I don't want to crunch my shadows too much, but it looks like right around 15 or 17 I'm starting to get nice rich darks in these windows at the bottom, on this car, on these light posts. That's definitely the direction we want to go. And then I'm going to come back up, hit M for mask. Let's burn in the highlights up here at the top where the sky is. Again, on a cloudy day, it's going to be a pretty white sky, so my expectations are not super high, but I want to bring in some of the kind of gray clouds, give that the top of that building a little bit more definition here. That looks great. M again for that graduated filter. We'll pull another mask over the pavement here, which always tends to bounce back quite a bit of light from the sky. hit M again, and then I'm going to hit K to burn in some of the highlights just on the side of this building because it is definitely a bright white color. Perfect. Okay. You might have a couple of small factors that you want to get rid of, like this little intrusion or this lamppost. So I'm going to hit Q, and we'll go ahead and clone out those objects kind of getting in the way. Let's make it a little bit less of a feather. There we go. So now that's fully disappeared. Perfect. One thing I want to point out also with this image is I just sort of want to show you how many pictures I took, just standing at this corner waiting for there to not be a big Uber van in the way of the picture, and I ultimately decided on this one, but notice I definitely took several photos trying to find that perfect right moment, and I think this one did it the best for me. And going and photographing buildings at dawn or dusk is also not only useful for the beautiful light that you can get, but there'll be less cars, less people, foot traffic on the road, so you can emphasize the building instead of having cars everywhere. And the interesting thing about cars and photos is that they sort of date the picture right away. You can tell when a photo was taken based on what the assortment of cars is in the frame. Or they can really make you feel like you're going through a time warp if there's an old car in a new photo. But cars do have this sort of interesting relationship with time when we see them in pictures. So it's something to be aware of. Let's do our last adjustment with sharpness, and then we'll move forward to the next few photos. So I'm going to add about 65, 66 points of sharpening. Here's our before, here's our after, and this photo looks really, really nice at this point. Okay, so here's an extreme example of, let's say you take a picture in a hurry, you don't quite get that tripod leveled. The thing that will always save you if you're in doubt as far as your tripod placement, your leveling, the thing that will always save you is shooting wider than what you need. And I'm going to show you with this image of the Lincoln Park Library, which was photographed at a pretty severe angle, how much we can save with our transform tool in a case like this. So if I hold down the Option key, I'm going to go ahead and set my black and white points. That sky is super white behind here. I'm going to add my lens corrections and then come down to my transform area, and let's add a guided transformation here. We can find two verticals. That's pretty close, but the street feels a little bit wonky. So let's try their vertical transform. That feels a little bit better to me. It's kind of hard to pick a vertical over here because there's so many trees in the way. But it looks like their stock vertical transformation is working well. I'm going to hit Constrain Crop, which will get rid of the white space around the edge there. And then I'll hit the R button to crop even further, knowing that we left ourselves all of this extra space here. And I can get the oblique of that building, the corner of that building, really nice and centered here as I work on my crop. Okay, so now we have the building. Let's pull out my highlights, shadows up, maybe about 30, 40. I don't want it to totally blow out like that. That's a little bit too severe. It looks like right about somewhere between 40 and 60 will work really well for us. We'll add in some of that contrast. and clarity, pull out some of the yellows that were emphasized when we pushed our contrast. And then I'm going to pop down to our HSL window and selectively identify my oranges and yellows here. That looks a lot better. But now that image has some really nice punchy contrast to it. Let's add in some tone curve adjustments to push that even a little bit further. And we'll go up to our sharpening detail tab and add in about 60 to 70 as far as sharpening. Again, you're noticing the sky is super, super white, as is the pavement, and that tends to start to become a little bit dominant in the photo. So I'm going to use M for mask to burn in my highlights on the top and the bottom. Pull that down over the sky here. And then I'll use my K button to burn in some of the highlights in the windows and the reflective brick on the side here. Alright, so hopefully at this point you're starting to get into the groove, starting to get the hang of what this looks like. And how much of a difference great editing can make on architecture. So let's do two more here. Adjusting my black and white point. Adding my lens corrections. My vertical transformation here. Constrain the crop. See, this one didn't work so well, so it looks like I'm going to need to crop this myself, but I photographed really nice and wide, so I have the space to do it. I always want to make sure I have some road in front of my building. A common kind of mistake that some photographers will make is they'll crop all the way up to the building like this or like this, but in order to have that gravitational feel, that sense of gravity, we want to include some of the street with the building. Perfect. Let's get into our tonal range corrections here. And the more you do this, the more you'll start to see what these corrections might be. And you can work through the images faster as you get the hang of it. We'll add a bit more contrast through the tone curve here. Sometimes I guess and don't get it quite right, so I go back and readjust. We'll pull out some of those oranges and yellows. Grab our mask to burn in the sky, burn in our highlights. And then if I want, I can grab that K tool and we'll brush in the highlights on the side of this industrial U-Haul building, and all of a sudden it sort of looks important. Moving on to our last image, this photo I took on the corner of Racine, not far from the Lincoln Park Library, and got this divvy biker right in the middle of the shot, but I think it kind of works out. I like that this person has a bit of motion blur going on, so this is kind of fun. We'll start with our white point and black point. So we have all of the detail opportunity in our sky here. And then Add lens corrections. Our vertical transformation. That looks really nice. A little bit of a crop. I'm going to crop out this tiny bitty lamppost thing. Sometimes the crop tool is like your best Photoshop tool. As weird as that sounds. Don't need Photoshop if you have a crop tool, but it's so true. I'm going to adjust my highlights, my shadows, really open up the dynamic range in this image. Push up my contrast and clarity. Compensate for my temperature. And make those tiny adjustments in HSL, especially since the red Chicago brick has a tendency to go pretty orange when contrast is pushed. Add some lights, darks, pull out some shadows. Grab M, let's burn in the highlights in the sky. And M again. Just like with vignetting, you never want your masks to call attention to themselves. They should be subtle enough, but making a difference that that you can see. Now I've hit K so that I can brush in, burn in specifically the bright side of this building. And then I'll come down and punch up my sharpness to 60, maybe 70. That's looking really nice, really sharp. So that's 5 different examples of ways that you can edit buildings, edit your architecture here. And I hope this is helpful as you guys are moving through your next project dealing specifically with architecture. And again, if you have any specific questions, please don't hesitate to reach out and chat about it. Awesome. Thanks so much.